It's wonderful to see everybody here. And I'll hand over, I think it might be worth handing over to you first, Tom, our first speaker, who's going to be talking to us about AI, ID, and critical thinking. How much can AI at present contribute to identifying and writing about classification and nature? So am I okay to hand over to you, Tom?
Happily. Can I just check that I'm sharing the right screen?
We can't see anything yet.
Oh, hang on.
Oh, hang on. It's just coming through. There you are. Yes, I think you are.
Something's here telling me to launch a meeting, and I don't want to start anything.
No.
Okay, I'm just gonna run with it.
Right.
Okay, so thank you for this opportunity to present this information, which started with with an MSc in biological photography and imaging, which the University of Nottingham closed just at the end of the last year. So these are my colleagues who taught on it. And anecdotally, I started asking students and staff about the use of AI and generally met with evasion. Until I asked them, until I told them that I use it and it saves me a lot of time. And based on openness, I found out that 100% so far of our students are using it. And this seems to be true with other members of staff. And we know that there's, that the horse is out of the box, it's bolted, the door's not shutting. So I was thinking about what the way forward is. And the University of Nottingham, in its wisdom, just immediately launched into this sort of panic attack and said, oh, we're just going back to writing exams in closed rooms. And I should say, I've added a lot of words onto this PowerPoint just because if anyone wants to go through it and see where some of my arguments come from, because I don't have time to go through them in detail, it should all be here, but there was just plenty of vitriol leveled at this way of students cheating. And to be honest, I think that ship has sailed. So I wanted to try and find a way of navigating through this complexity that's just been foisted upon us. One of the things that I taught was ID, for identification. We're equipping our students for a workplace in ecology and conservation. And those organizations were telling me that people graduating with a biology or a zoology degree, they're fine in labs and fine on molecular biology, but they don't have any skills. So we developed a module component which involved identifying things and photographing them. And I asked them for a vertebrate, an invertebrate, a plant, and a fungus. And they were just sent out. We taught them about the identification skills that they needed, how to do it, and they went off and produced a key or an introduction. So we asked, can we design an assessment that fosters a critical response to artificial intelligence and a strategy for its use? And I decided to test it on the ID project. So we asked them to use the Merlin app to identify birdsong, to photograph a number of these birds and identify them with Google Lens, and then use ChatGPT, or in those days, Bard, or whatever AI, to generate some information with references about the area and the birds that they found. Then I asked them, and I noticed Jeffrey in the chat last time said, caution against asking students to check the output. But what we asked them for them to do is mark the output. And that actually gave them a chance to, find the skills that their work would be submitted to. So I went through how to mark things with them. If you haven't used Merlin, it's absolutely fantastic. You sit in any area of countryside or cityscape with some trees, and it identifies every song that you hear. Google Lens here is identifying one of the Mediterranean geckos that have been living in the building that I work in, that were released accidentally 50 years ago. So they were identifying things with Google Lens. I tested generative AI by visiting an arboretum in Gloucestershire and then asking it to write a discussion about it, which it did. The fact that I misspelt Tortworth Court didn't phase it at all. So it kind of identified Tortworth as Totworth, and it got that it was in Gloucestershire, but it made up so much rubbish. And though it was beautifully written and quite aspirational, you know, my hackles were raised because it wasn't true. So what we asked our students to do, what I asked them to do, was to set the task using AI to evaluate and mark and look at its, you know, what the generative contribution is, what its usefulness, and then reflect on their personal experience and how they would use it in the future. Very small sample size so far. So I've added my first year tutees to the mix, but they're just using generative AI on this topic. But this is more about how to write essays and then evaluate what the contribution of AI to that could be. So the sample size has increased slowly. What the general impression was, and I used sentiment analysis to look at their comments, was that you got instant answers. It came across as very authoritative and believable. What they thought about Merlin was it really is useful. It opens whole new worlds of sampling birdsong, but without an expert, you absolutely have to take it on trust. And in fact, the only things I could find were some old records of Percy Thrower whistling birdsong to compare it with. Google Lens, amazingly helpful, but shows no working. It's just comparing images. So we still need corroboration from sources that give reasons for why you would classify a bird or any particular thing that you're looking at as the object that it tells you it is. And we came then to the response to generative AIs, and there is a mixture of positives and negatives. So the students found it fascinating, very good for initial drafts. It highlights areas that they hadn't considered. For instance, that our university campus is managed for wildlife, which wasn't part of what they thought they'd include. Very good for proofreading, especially for special educational needs students. So they're handing in much better work than they would normally consider as typical of their abilities. So it's a good boost to confidence, and it helps to build a basis for their essays. The slightly more nuanced views was that it's very challenging to work with a chatbot, and that they're not trustworthy because they lack substance. And in fact, the big issue they had was a constant need to check on the information that's been presented. There's a big time drain out of that. And at least so far, the models are using out-of-date referencing. In fact, I had an essay handed in on sauropod dinosaurs saying they'd been discovered in every continent except Antarctica. And I said, hang on, I know it's been in Antarctica recently. And then all the references ended in 2017. They then were considering about attribution issues. Where is this AI looking? And, you know, what level of competence is to be found in its own searching for information? And then they were obviously very concerned whether or not it was plagiarism. So we had these issues to deal with. Students also concerned that they had little experience of essay writing, full stop. And I would say I can tell students who'd done the International Baccalaureate over A-levels very swiftly. They had never marked anything before, so I had to go through that in more detail. And they wonder what the next generation of AI will be capable of. So they talked about careful prompts to get the information they wanted. They needed to be vigilant. There was the question of the ethics of using AI for, relying on for your information and checking. And there was a constant concern about what the future is for humans. I would somewhat reluctantly say one of the best things I've read about it was in Eton School's Caitlin Cookbook for how to use AI for generating questions and interacting with students in order to help their learning. And then word of warning from Microsoft Copilot is that AI is a good collaborator, but not a good master. And experts are needed to validate the information generated by AI. And it's essential to combine AI-generated content with expert knowledge for a comprehensive understanding of these intricate systems, which I was using for identification projects, but which have been, the mission has crept to, student interactions with their subject. So again, on limited numbers, said that the only way to be safe with this is to be competent, to encourage critical thinking and awareness, which I do feel that being able to check the output of AI as a reflective essay and as marking, help them with their own understanding of how to write. And a big part of this, certainly in my field, is to understand the scientific method and the construction of arguments. Take-home message is that humans are easily fooled and that AI gives a predicted average answer, but not necessarily the knowledgeable one. Have I used my time? Because that's the end.
You have indeed. You were bang on time. So thanks ever so much for that. I think it's probably worth us saving verbal questions until all of our speakers have presented, simply so everyone gets the same opportunity to do so. But there are some questions for you in the chat, Tom, if you wanted to have a quick look and to respond to any of those. Some really interesting ones, particularly around the nature of AI, looking at sort of specific data sets versus all of the internet, as it were. Environmental concerns given the disciplinary context of this activity, which I think is a very fair question, and on the kind of active reflection where AI kind of sits within that process as well. But I think just without further ado, we'll move on to Marie Cruz, who has reappeared. Thanks ever so much for coming back, Marie Cruz. And do let me know if you're having any access issues or any technological stuff going on in the background as well. But otherwise, I'm more than happy to introduce Marie Cruz Garcia, who's found the share button already. Thank you so much for that. Who's going to talk about a design guide for the integration of AI in authentic assessment, and take it away.
Okay, thank you. I hope nothing happened this time. I wasn't sure if it was me. I'm glad to find out it's not. No, I can say if I have the privilege and the honor to deliver one of the first programs in Spain, and also I think within the European Union, that it was covering how to use generative artificial intelligence to enhance learning, and also for lecturers on how to integrate approaches and strategies to use Gen AI into assessment. I believe we have around 10 minutes or something around that, 10, 15. So I'm not going to cover everything this here. I have to say this was with the University of Las Palmas, but before you get very excited, I'm not in Las Palmas, I'm in Scotland in Fife, because my main job is in a Scottish university, and I am very grateful that they have given me this time to have this presentation. Publicity break, I am available for a remote consultancy if you want to know more about the different strategies of how to integrate AI into assessment. Yes, for this 10 minutes presentation, I am going to be covering the integration of artificial intelligence in authentic assessment. You will notice that sometimes I say IE instead of AI, and it's because I am used to teaching in Spanish, you pronounce AI, so I am trying to remember IE, IA, but sorry if I say I is artificial intelligence. So before we move on, this is the link to my presentation, and I'm going to be conscious of my time. Just in the chat, I will not be able to answer or see everybody as I'm presenting, but I wanted to know if you do teach or you support learning and teaching, if you are already using artificial intelligence in assessment, if you are familiar with authentic assessment. It would be interesting to know, although as I say, I will not be able to answer all of you through this presentation, but I'm really interested in all that. Incidentally, I did notice, well, first I'm going to start with clarifying what is authentic assessment, in case somebody might not know, which is a type of assessment that tries to replicate or connect or link what is taught in the classroom, what the professional activities, the kind of tasks that our students will face in the real world. I noticed that one of our attendees, to many other experts that I know you are, is Kay Sambel, which I want to say is an honor for me that you are here, because everything I learned before any artificial intelligence, and one of the references for my course, the course I teach on authentic assessment and artificial intelligence, was Kay Sambel and Sally Brown as well. So I really recommend her works and the reading if you want to learn more about authentic assessment. Just gonna pass the this one. Sorry, no, yeah. I think I'm gonna move on because we know the major characteristic of authentic assessment that I am gonna explain in more detail. One of the key messages for this session is the introduction or the integration or the use of artificial intelligence assessment does not always mean innovation, or it's not always a synonym of innovation. We need to introduce artificial intelligence with a pedagogical purpose, for a particular purpose. So that would be one of my key messages, and sometimes they might be really a specific situation or cases in which the use of artificial intelligence in assessment is not permitted. Coming back into the aim of the subject of this presentation, which is a very simplified design guide to integrate artificial intelligence into authentic assessment. Before we even think of integrating or thinking about approaches for integrating artificial intelligence into our assessment tasks, we need to define clearly these 5 steps that I summarize here, which is the framework for authentic assessment. The authentic assessment is always based on a type of project, a task, a problem, inquiry that the students need to solve. This problem could be given by the assessor, by the lecturer, or we can give our students freedom to decide their own projects. Authentic assessment also comprises a solution. It is very important, if you are using authentic assessment and with artificial intelligence, that you clarify and define very, very clearly with your students, and you discuss this with your students, what is the task that the students need to undertake and what would be accepted as a solution and in which format. If the task at the solution involves writing a report is fine, but what happens if the task involves digital multimedia content, for example, developing a digital artifact or an interview or a podcast, just developing a podcast. That's what I say. First is to define very clearly what your students, the task, and the solution and the format for this task. Professional context is important in authentic assessment, nothing happen in isolation. The task that you give your students has to be framed in a professional context as well and is a social context, because learning does not happen in isolation. And I'm gonna elaborate this social context in detail. 5 is you need to consider very, very careful the evaluation criteria, not only in terms of what technical skills body of academic knowledge you are going to assess, but whether if you are going to assess as part of the assessment is going to be embedded, explicit or implicit, any AI competences. There are different frameworks for AI competences. We don't have time here. Also the AI literacy of your students, because assessment can be also a way of developing the AI competences of your students as well. So this is the 4 steps that you need to consider, or the framework, before designing the authentic assessment tags and before deciding if you want to incorporate the use of artificial intelligence or not. So now we're going to go, and very simplified, of course, because of the timing, the step-by-step guide for integrating Gen AI into our authentic assessment. So the first step is to think very carefully in the context, is the professional context that you give for the tags. For example, imagine that you are a journalist investigating into climate change. You need to produce a report, or you need to produce an interview of that. So you need to consider this professional context very well. I think for this point, I would like to see more collaboration, and I think between the academic world and industry experts, that you would learn a lot from what is happening in the industry now, or in the daily work or sector activity in which our students are expecting to perform that task. The social context, and I want to highlight the importance of that, is we need to consider the level of maturity of our students if you want to introduce the use of artificial intelligence, but also for authentic assessment as well. My personal experience is authentic assessment works better with mature students from the last year's students that understand the purpose of assessment, and students that they have a certain level or certain knowledge of assessment literacy. The next step is, and it would be in this point which in which we might consider, or there would be a sub-step about whether we allow the use of artificial intelligence or not. First, we need to design very carefully the problem, the inquiry, or the task. We can use, as lecturers, as assessors, we can use Gen AI tools to help us to define this task, to help us to simulate real-life scenarios. There are tools for that already, and there are GPTs specifically on that. We need to define and design very carefully in this step, as I mentioned before, what would be accepted as a solution and the formats in which we want that solution. If it is an MP4 video, an MP3 file, if it is a written document, we might also need to consider if this task is for a student, for a student to develop, undertake individually, or it's going to be a group assessment. Also, to define the specific deadlines and the intermediate project task deliverables. As I will mention later, I always recommend for authentic assessment, allow students to submit a formative draft as part of with the course when the feedback is still relevant for them, to use that feedback to improve their work. And it's now in this step 2, when we are designing the task, when we can consider how are we gonna allow students to use the generative artificial apps, and what would be considered an acceptable or ethical use of Gen AI. Now we have 1 year ago, non-universities, so 2 years ago, have any policies on acceptable use of artificial intelligence or not. Now we all have the University of Las Palmas as well, the Scottish University as well. We have frameworks of our policies for acceptable or not acceptable use, but those policies are very generic. So I always advise we need to use these policies as a starting point to write down our specific guidance and recommendations for our students for our particular course. Before we consider how we're going to use Gen AI in our assessment, how we're going to allow our students to use it is 2 points very specific. We need to be clear whether our students has a minimum level of AI competences, AI literacy to use Gen AI in the assessment, and whether all our students has equal access to Gen AI apps. It's very important that you check that. And obviously, because Copilot is included in the educational license of most of European universities, I would say use Copilot or use always Gen AI tools supported by your university, your institution, as accepted apps which are accepted for your assessments. When the other aspect that you need to consider is what uses do I allow in my authentic assessments of artificial intelligence? So I'm keeping an eye of the chronometer as well to ensure I'm in time. You
Just
might
one more minute, if that's okay, Marie.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm gonna be faster. As I recommend, this is a revisited Bloom taxonomy linking how Gen AI can support different cognitive process. If we have time, we can look at this in further detail. But I would recommend start with using Gen AI to support the most basic cognitive process, or the basic starting from the beginning. We're using like verbs like remember, understand, apply, and leaving, for example, using Gen AI to create or add value to the final assessment for later when you have more experience in the use of Gen AI into assessment. So I think the grading process is, we are all okay and familiar with it, but I would like in the grading and evaluation criteria, consider the AI competences and the AI literacy that whether you want to assess this as part of the assessment are going to be embedded. And obviously that would be different depending on although all the frameworks for defining AI competences are very similar, but if you are in the UK, I imagine you will follow the GISC one. So that would be something depending on the policies, AI policies and the frameworks that we use. And I think the feedback process, I'm going to stay longer because the principles I give here are principles of good principles of assessment, and always say, when you provide a feedback that feed forward. Allow students to submit their drafts and to receive formative feedback for the drafts when this feedback is still relevant and timely to them, when they can still use this feedback as part of their course in order to improve the final process. And I think that was all. I sent the link in the chat, and I don't want to take time from the other speaker. I apologize for not being able to answer or look at what is in the chat now, but I will be looking at that as we move forward. And I think that was all. Sana will be around for if there are any questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marie Cruz. That was wonderful. I'm going to hand over immediately to Sue Beckingham. Again, there are questions in the chat, and I imagine all of our speakers are happy to take questions after the session has ended as well. But without further ado, let's let the floor go to Sue.
That's showing the right screen.
We can see your presenter view.
Okay, it's always swap presenter. There we go. Is that
That's
in?
better, yeah.
Super. Okay, so I'm going to come at things from a slightly different angle, and I'm going to look at using generative AI to look at the assessment brief itself. So I've use lots of multimodal tools over the years, including screencasts. I use a Kahoot quiz to get the students to, to find out the students understand the assessment brief, etc. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So typically your assessment brief is a written piece, and the aim here is, quoting Sample Kay, who's in the audience, is to provide clarity and direction so the students know what to focus on. So Forsyth says, don't assume that students will automatically pore over your assessment brief without you bringing it explicitly to their attention. So it's important that you go through this in multiple times, but then there's also the opportunity to provide alternatives that the students can look at in different modes in their own time. And Tana Marvilla have just published a new paper today and remind us that actually actively engaging with content is what helps to build understanding. So in my case study, I'm going to be looking at adding image and audio. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is the use of infographics. I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of an infographic, and at its very basic, a pie chart kind of visualizes things. You can use color, and it helps to augment what you're actually trying to get across. So the tool that I'm going to share that I've used today is Napkin. So basically this is currently a free tool. So you can import a text document. You can see on the screen there's a variety of different ones, or you can put in prompts. And what it will do is create you a selection of different infographics that pick out the points in the text. And then you can choose which one you want. You can add labels, you can change the colour, you can change the font, etc. So the prompts that I put in was looking at the process of the dissertation module. So what kinds of things do students need to focus on pre-writing, during the writing phase, and post-writing. So this is what I fed into Napkin. And the first infographic that it did was simply summarise those 4 points. So it gives me that infographic. As I say, there's varieties on the different styles of these different images. So you choose which one you want to actually integrate into what you're going to be sharing with your students. The next one was the pre-writing. So I quite like this because it was focusing on the topic selection, something I'm currently going through in the first week of teaching this week. I met my dissertation students yesterday, first lecture, and of course getting them to decide on the topic is really important. And then they have to do some reading and then think about how they're going to approach the research design. And then the academic writing structure, it created this, and it actually sort of brought in some extra text in there. So it's a nice way to visualise and, again, augment what I've got in my assessment brief. And then the post-writing and submission stage there, it talks about the importance of proofreading, your plagiarism check, even down to the submission, so the timely and correct submission of the work, so it's in the right format, etc. It did go on to the final stage, which isn't applicable to all dissertations, but sometimes you might have a viva that might be informal, formative assessment, or it might be part of the summative assessment. So something to consider there if that was applicable for your dissertations. So that was the first part of it. And then the second was to look at how I could use podcasts as a way to discuss the assessment brief and the guidance that I've just shown you, so the visualizations, the stages of the dissertations. So, you know, this is a way that students can interact with it in a different way. It's something that they would do in their own time afterwards. So they'd look at the written piece, but then they could listen to the podcast. So for those of you not familiar with Notebook LM, essentially one of the features of this is that you can put in either prompts or text, and I put in PDFs of both of the artifacts, and it creates a podcast. And it's 2 individuals, a male and a female, and they discuss my assessment brief and what bits are important for the students. So one of the prompts was, you know, can you pull out what the students need to focus on in it? So it kind of went through the key components, the structure of it all, the different sections, what my expectations are of a dissertation. And something else that I include in the dissertation is keeping a research log. So the students have to share that with their supervisors in their regular meetings, and they have to put in detail the books and the journal articles that they've been reading, and then they have a discussion section in it, and they would talk about that in their meetings. So it talks about the value and importance of using that and proper referencing. So that was Notebook LM's summary from the documents that I actually put in. So that comes up on the first screen. And what you're produced with is a link to share with your students, and it's an audio player essentially. And that runs for 5 minutes discussing, as I've said, the assessment brief there. So early days, release this to my students. We'll find out. I should be sort of taking this further to find out what their thoughts on it and how helpful it is in relation to the other multimodal ways that I augment the written assessment brief. And there are the references. Okay, so I'll stop sharing there. Just gives us a little bit of time left, I think.
Perfect. Yes, there are a couple of
Bit
minutes for
rushed.
questions. Thank you so much, Sue. Well, I think what we'll do is we'll have a couple of minutes for questions, 2 minutes at the most, and then we'll have a 5-minute break before the next session starts at 11 o'clock. If that's okay. If there are any questions that anyone's burning to ask to any of our speakers, if you do have something that's a little bit more involved, then please feel free to, I imagine, contact them after the session has ended. I'm sure they won't mind. But otherwise, we'll we have time for maybe one or two.
One from Amanda about Notebook LM. Can it be embedded, or is it just a URL link? As far as I'm aware, Sam, you might know differently. It's just a link.
It is just a link as far as
Yeah.
I can see. Yeah, I'm not sure if the podcast can be downloaded and shared either. Locally.
I've audio recorded it in the past.
Oh, that's a good
and shared
idea.
that.
Yeah, so there are
Yeah. So
workarounds.
You
Yeah.
could put that into another tool. Great idea.
Oh, it can be downloaded. Thank you, Neville. That's good. Two American voices diving in. Yes, it does do that.
Sam, just to say, because I know about assessment and different approaches is so big, I just attach a link to my blog. It's not, if you see subscribe, just pass that. It's free and you don't have to subscribe or anything. Just ensure people, I just want to pass the link, have access, because I explain in more detail the recommendation or guidance for when you start using generative artificial intelligence in assessment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And with that, I think it's probably worth calling it at that point, just for a 5-minute break or so. This room will stay open because the next session is a workshop session that's hosted by myself, Peter, and Sue. That will kick off at 11 o'clock. So if you do want to stay and hear a bit more about Notebook LM, seeing as we are sort of drifting towards that topic, I think it's sort of become the sort of thing that's characterizing most of the day, I think, up to this point, then do please stick around for this one. The other 2 rooms will be having workshops from some of the project team as well. But otherwise, we'll see you all back here in 5 minutes. And huge thanks to all of our speakers as well. You're back. Is my screen coming through okay? Can you see it?
Yes, it is.
Fantastic.
Perfecto.
And if I switch to another one, has that moved over as well?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm flicking across multiple things. So I'm just shared my screen. I'm also sharing audio, so hopefully that's going to come across as well. Just going to wait for Peter to appear as well. Are you there, Peter? I will assume not for a second.
Yes, is the answer.
Ah, there you are, Peter. Hello.
Just reappearing.
You just appeared. Recording has resumed. Thanks ever so much to Ruth for setting the recording going as well. But I will say again, just because this is now technically a separate session, even though the room has remained open, that this event is being recorded for training promotional purposes, and the University of Liverpool does own the recording. You can opt out at any time. Do please give us a shout if you do want to do so. And if you're not comfortable with being recorded or appearing on the recording, then do please feel free to keep your camera off and your microphone off as well, and use the chat function instead to engage. And I think that's all of my obligations in terms of making sure that the recording is okay, fulfilled. So I'm just going to switch over to my slides now. And thanks ever so much to everyone for coming back to this final session of our Generative AI and Multimodal Symposium today. I'm joined by Peter Hartley and Sue Beckingham, both of which I think we've heard from already today as well. And we're going to be talking to you a little bit more about using generative AI to develop students' assessment literacy through audio creation. We've kind of touched on this a little bit already, particularly in Sue's case study, in terms of using podcasts to engage with the assessment briefs and things like that. But we wondered whether using AI in multimodal context might be particularly helpful to help students to engage with their assessments, to consider the kind of wider context of the assessment, and actually kind of, in some cases, sort of interrogate the assessment itself in a kind of dialogic feedback context. And really, we're sort of interested to hear a little bit about what you think the potential for this project is as well. So we have kind of heard from people who have done case studies up to this point, 3 glorious speakers in our last session who talked about activities they have done with their students. This one's a little bit more speculative in that we are proposing an activity that we're going to do with our students using this technology, and we kind of invite thoughts on whether they think or you think it will be particularly useful. And at some point when the guide comes out, we'll be able to tell you whether we were right or not when we actually do try it with our students. Have I covered everything, Peter and Sue? Does that make, is that about right? Yep.
Perfect.
I think it is, Sam. But I think the other point we want to perhaps chip in is that
Yes.
one of the reasons why we are speculating is because this software is so new.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been aware of Notebook LM, including the kind of podcast feature, for probably a month or two. But the notion that they've now made it into a product, there's now a license for it as well as the free version. They're increasing the facilities on it all the time. Who knows where it will be in 6 months' time?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, exactly that. And it is such a new area, but we do think there is some potential for it in terms of the formative feedback process for it to kind of be integrated into it. And we wonder whether it might have a positive effect. So anyway, thank you. I will just quickly move on. I've got a couple of questions. This is a workshop, so we're hoping that people will engage with us a bit. So I'm going to post a link to our Padlet in the chat here. And you'll notice there are a couple of questions on the Padlet that kind of concern assessment literacy. So really kind of basic stuff. What does assessment literacy mean to you? How have you helped to develop your students' assessment literacy in the past? What kind of techniques have you used? What approaches have you taken? What kind of things have you tried? And in which, if any context, has that used audio or even AI? If you can think of it as well. And in what context do you think the assessment literacy is best developed? Do you think it's something you do in class? Is it asynchronously? Is it on a one-to-one basis? Is it a combination of all of those things? And yeah, we're just kind of interested to know what your thoughts are on this. So I'm just going to open the Padlet link up and it should appear here. So you can see 2 columns, assessment literacy, opening questions. So just put your answer to the questions in that column for us to start off. And there is a link there to Notebook LM itself as well and the wider Symposium Padlet, but do feel free to put things into our Padlet. I'll just give it a minute or so. There's a comment from Stephen at Napier. Fluidity of the tech doesn't really help for staff and students to get to grips with it. That's a really good point. It moves so quickly that once we've got a grasp of how one app works and how we might potentially use it, the next one's out and we have to do it all again. That's a very good point. The accessibility and equity of the tools, yeah, that's a good point. I'm just going to bring the questions back up. There you go. And we'll have a look at the answers in a second. It's institutional license issues, etc. Yeah, that's a really good point as well. Okay, I'll give it another minute. Put the questions in the Padlet. Yes, I can do that. If I copy those. So everyone now has to watch me do that. Sorry about that. I pinned that one. There we go. So we've got some responses appearing now. Students' practical, conceptual, and academic understanding of the assessment, what's expected, why it's expected, why it matters. Yeah, really good. Yes, and I often tie that when I'm doing workshops with staff, I tend to tie that into sort of transparency around the assessment as well. So the more transparent the assessment, obviously the better, because the part of the assessment's challenge shouldn't be accessing it. You know, it should be something the students have already seen, that they're aware of, that might have sort of disciplinary or esoteric characteristics, etc. I start my lectures and seminars by describing the assessment to reduce anxiety. Yeah, really great. I love that. I do that too. Every module I teach, the first session, first question, what is the assessment? It's this, don't panic. You know, you're going to get to this and we'll understand what it is. And these aren't things you haven't seen elsewhere, or if you haven't seen them before, they're way less complex than you think they are, because they always sound more scary than they are as well. Yep, good. Assessment literacy, asking students to self-assess against learning outcomes. Yep, and involving them in generating rubrics. Yeah, I love that idea. Student involvement and co-creation is brilliant. The aim of AI is to break through the disengagement barrier. We need to find something the students respond to. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You know, can AI help us to kind of move those barriers forward, or to change the nature of them a little bit, or to even to break them down completely? Yes. All assessments delivered with a tutorial, writing workshops, etc. Yeah, using Padlet, unpacking videos with a description attached. Audio feedback. Students loved hearing us argue about their work. That's a great idea. It's a human podcast talking about their work. You've preempted us, but you've done it with real people instead. Much better than what we're planning. What's that one? My main focus on academic integrity. It's been shared across the unit. Thank you so much for that, Laura. We'll have a look at that separately. Developing student assessment literacy, so helping them to see what quality and standards look and feel like in a specific context. Yeah, it needs to be interactive and dialogic. That's good, because I'm going to go into that in a second. So that's useful to know. They need to have a go at applying criteria and standards. Exemplars are good for this in big groups. Yeah, show what an example of an assessment looks like. This is the kind of thing you're going to be producing. And obviously the classic, you know, can you mark it? Can you rate it? Can you compare it against the marking criteria that I'm going to be comparing it to? And students are always inherently far harsher than they otherwise need to be. Yeah, there we go. Emma from Dundee, getting students to evaluate sample work without telling them. Here's an example of A. Yep. Students understanding how to succeed, not just in content, but in application. Yeah, good. God, there's so many. I can't go through them all. I'm really sorry. I won't be able to get through them all, but there's lots of really, really good ideas coming through here. Yes, all of these. We've done everything. Marvelous. Assessment literacy, as students engaging and doing something with their feedback. Yeah, that's a really good point too. It sort of goes beyond the assessment context, and we have to start thinking about the feedback literacy angle to this as well. And that brings me really nicely onto the kind of next point I really wanted to make. Unless actually, Sue, Peter, have I missed anything that you want to sort of pick up on?
Quick question, actually, for everybody.
Sure.
Has anybody tried asking the students to generate their learning outcomes and their assessment criteria? Been involved in a project on that some years ago, and they came up with some really excellent suggestions, which then became part of the module.
Student co-creation in module design. Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, we have done a bit of that at Liverpool. There's a history module that involves students kind of completing the module at the same time as designing it. So they designed the module at the same time as actually doing it. So they said we should do this, and then they did do that. And then the assessment at the end was a sort of evaluation of whether the module could be piloted with a larger group of students, which then went to a sort of a committee to see whether it actually could be sort of launched to a much wider cohort of students. And it was. They sort of took the design of the module that the students had sort of experimented with throughout completing it, and then launched it to the actual program. And now it's actually kind of on the books, as it were, which was a marvelous way, if a little resource intensive, way of designing modules. Wonderful.
The only quick thing that I would add is with all aspects of this is the clarity of language and involving students in and doing that. You know, the concept of the hidden curriculum, the language that we use, we understand it, but you know, we make assumptions whether our students, whether they're home or international students, understand it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Really good point. Thank you. A couple of things in the chat. It's given an opportunity to co-create the assessment task for a module studying based on learning outcomes really help with understanding of the assessment. Yeah, so if you can help our students to design the assessment that they then have to go and do, they're going to have a much better understanding of what it is they actually need to complete, because they help to sort of put it together. Wonderful, thank you. Okay, So we've kind of gestured towards this idea of students kind of being in conversation with everyone, I guess, around their assessment, understanding what it is they need to do, when they need to do it, what the artifact looks like, what it looks like in practice, what a good one looks like, etc. We kind of think that there might be a space for artificial intelligence to help students develop their assessment and their feedback literacy in the dialogic context. And that's kind of, I think everyone can see where this is going in terms of the presence of Notebook LM and its podcast sort of generation capacity. So we'll sort of move on towards that point now. We can, I mean, this is kind of preaching to the choir, I think, when we talk about why we develop student assessment literacy, and obviously everyone's kind of put their thoughts on this in the Padlet already. But obviously, this is quite a classic perspective that interventions aimed at garnering enhanced learning from assessment should target the development of students' assessment literacy. They must know what it is they have to do and how they have to do it. And that kind of puts an emphasis on meta dialogue about assessment. We need to talk to our students, and students need to talk to us, and they need to talk to each other about the assessment and its purpose and how it functions. And it's our responsibility to help students to develop their ability to judge their own and others' work around them as well. And that will very, very likely enhance their learning outcomes. The better they know and the better they kind of applied their knowledge in the evaluation of an assessment artifact or an artifact in general, the more they're going to learn about the topic themselves. And I think we all know that. And I think we all accept that. But we also think there is this kind of space for audio in this kind of process, if you like, as well. There is a growing body of literature that's explored the use of technology in providing students with more meaningful, personalized and enhanced feedback or feed forward. And I think a few people have done this in the room as well. Students are more likely to be digitally literate than in prior generations. That is potentially true. And that could be why audio and video feedback is obviously making headway in this process. And we've seen really good examples already of people doing that. And I really love that idea of students listening into the conversations that their tutors are having about their work and sort of thinking and reflecting on what their tutors are saying. I think that's such a good idea. And I might steal that. Thank you to whoever that was. I can't remember your name. I'm sorry. And we also think about this in kind of dialogic context as well. Audio feedback is obviously inherently more dialogic than text. I don't think it's too contentious to be able to say that. Written feedback is fine, and it can be really useful if students use it in the right context and have the skills to be able to make the leap in using textual feedback in a way that's actually useful for them. Audio feedback does create a kind of heightened sense of connectivity between the lecturer and the student. And is often perceived kind of more positively than written feedback as well. Feedback is a kind of dialogic process, and that can be between the tutor and the student, or the student and other students, or the student and themselves, or whoever they happen to kind of be talking to at the time. But what we're sort of interested in is this idea of feedback as dialogue with the work itself. And we're thinking about sort of alternative forms of feedback as well, helping to promote a sense of belonging in students, relative, in relation to the program of study, in relation to the teaching staff. And it's also a very communicative act, like I said, and a social process in which power, emotion, discourse impact on how messages are constructed, interpreted, and acted on. So if we can think about feedback as this dialogic process with all the kind of different, I'm not going to use the word stakeholders, but I guess interested parties that sort of involved in the assessment process, the tutor, the student, each other, etc. And the more we talk about the work, the more we talk about the process, the more we learn, I guess, is the overall point that we are getting towards. So as feedback is a dialogic process, we're kind of arguing, I guess, preemptively, because we haven't done this case study yet, that the work itself should also be something that students can engage with. Students obviously prefer being able to seek feedback from their peers and their tutors, etc. But we wonder whether AI can help students to engage in meaningful discourse with the work itself. And we think this may help to develop students' assessment and feedback literacy, because they're kind of talking to the work and seeing how it's done the task that the student has tried to complete, as it were. And this is where we think that Notebook LM or similar apps that perform a similar function might be able to help us. Sue, Peter, have I covered everything that we needed to there?
Yes, I think so. Just one thought on audio feedback, because that's coming up in the chat as well, is that we did a project on this some years ago, but one of the tutors commented how much better audio feedback was at delivering bad news, in the sense of, you've not done this assignment very well. And it's partly, I think, down to tone of voice. It's also down to the amount of detail you can put in for the same time commitment in terms of audio. So, I mean, there's all sorts of interesting potential, and audio feedback never seems to have been taken on in any great scale. And I think that's largely down to getting the systems to work with it. But perhaps now we have the potential to do it.
You might want to speak to Andrew Middleton about that, and Anne Norcliffe. They've done quite a lot on giving audio feedback as an audio file. But another aspect is giving feedback verbally in the classroom in a seminar, and asking the students to record that as an audio file, which they can then revisit later. So there's different dimensions of it.
Absolutely. The kind of scope or scale, if you like, of the implementation of audio feedback, I think is something that we've never quite managed to get over, but there are snippets of really good practice that are kind of going on in lots of different places. I'm interested by Jordan's point in the chat, where he said that they've had the opposite experience of audio feedback, where the snippet is recorded by the grader, it just sounds like they're reading text. So I think that's, and so why don't we just send the text? I think that's an interesting perspective. There needs to be a distinction in what audio feedback is trying to do, or the way that it's phrased, or the sort of, the terms that exist within it, or the way that it's intoned. I think that's something we need to talk about when we're talking to tutors about why we should provide audio feedback. It isn't just an audio version of textual feedback. It needs to do something different, or say it in a different way. And I think that's really useful as well. I am trying to keep up with the chat as I go through this, but it's very, very busy. So I will do my best to see everything. So this is kind of where we're moving on to, here we go. Isn't there a danger that you may, if you're recording audio feedback, you may tell them what you really think? I hope we do. Tell them what we really think about the work.
In a constructive and polite way.
In a constructive way, absolutely, as well. I understand the perspective, though. That is a good point. So we are kind of interested in how the student can talk to the work, how they can sort of discourse with the work, if you want to use discourse as a verb. And this is kind of where Notebook LM kind of comes into the conversation. Now, I don't know, I got a sense from the sessions earlier on today that lots of people have seen this app and lots of people are aware of what it can do. But just on the off chance that we haven't, or there are some people in the room who haven't seen what Notebook LM can do yet, we are going to give just a little bit of a demonstration or a little bit of a showcase for the app and what it can do and the kind of functions that are associated with it. And then I'll go through a little bit more in detail of what the activity we want to do with our students actually is. So let me just bring it up. There we go. Here's that sharing.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So for those who don't know, Notebook LM is Google's sort of research assistant and note-taking app that's recently been released, as Peter mentioned, within the last kind of month or so. It sort of organizes research and resources and helps the user to kind of engage with them and to kind of identify themes that might appear across them and to organize their notes and to kind of organize the resources in ways that sort of help them to create another artifact or to sort of organize their thoughts a little bit more comprehensively, I suppose. So on the left-hand side, there is a sort of sources section where users can kind of add a source to which the notebook will refer. So in this instance, I've uploaded a thesis that I wrote for an MA that Liverpool runs very recently as well. And then in the middle, there is this kind of chat function that sort of presents, I guess, information based on the data that's included in the sources. And you can sort of ask it questions of the resources and sort of organize your thoughts and ask what does it say, what are the salient points, how does it start, who does it reference, that kind of thing. So it ties itself directly to the resources on the left-hand side in the middle, if you like. But the bit we're interested in is the section on the right here under Studio. And this is kind of where the infamous podcast generation thing sort of lives, as it were, where it does kind of create a sort of usually between 10 and 20-minute podcast of the sort of resources that exist on the left-hand side. And it's two people kind of talking about the content contained within them. So I'm just going to load it up. I have already kind of preloaded it. And it shouldn't take too long to sort of appear. There we go. Otherwise, it would have taken quite a long time to come up. And we're just going to kind of give it a quick listen.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back. We're going deep today.
I can just say, did the audio share? Did that come through?
Yes, that came through.
It did,
That's
yeah.
good. Sometimes it doesn't work.
Oh, deep into a paper that really got me thinking.
Yeah,
It's by Samuel Saunders.
I know. Saunders.
It's called Decolonizing Authenticity with the single quotes.
Right?
Have you read this one?
Oh, yeah, totally fascinating.
It really challenges how we think about education,
Mm-hmm.
specifically authentic learning in universities.
Yeah, and that's a hot topic right now.
Sure.
I mean, Saunders' argument really gets at this tension between like preparing students for the real world.
That's the big push, right?
Huge, especially with universities needing to show their worth.
Right, prove their value.
Exactly. But then there's this whole movement to decolonize the curriculum.
Right.
You know, challenge those dominant Western perspectives.
Absolutely.
So it's like, can we actually have both?
It's a good question.
Big question.
Because when I hear authentic learning, I think hands-on, you know, internships, research projects.
The real world stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with a minute and sort of stop it there. I think that's probably enough of that. Does that make sense? And then obviously the kind of next part of this is the ability to kind of interact with the hosts. So you can start interactive mode, which is this sort of button here, and ask questions and sort of probe the host of the podcast to respond to anything. You can sort of say, so how does the paper deal with this? How does what did it miss? What could it do better, etc. It doesn't seem, yeah, I mean, there are some comments in the chat about the kind of quality of the podcast. That's a good point. It does have a non-British accent, and Marie Cruz, who spoke in our last session, talked quite a lot about, or mentioned in the chat, sorry, that it's not available in other languages yet, which I think is a really good point. And hopefully something that they'll change going forward.
That has been promised, Sam. That has been promised, yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. And yes, it does have a non-British accent. It's non-British, but it is clear and it's not too fast as well. And yes, there is a point in the chat as well, and I was going to come on to this, but it's worth mentioning it now. Notebook LM doesn't upload the data to train its models, and it's quite clear on its homepage that it doesn't do that. Which I think is useful, and it does help us to kind of justify using it just a little bit more. There are some things we could do, I think, to ensure that the kind of safety / protection of IP is maintained, I think, as well. That's, if we're talking to students about using this, then obviously that needs to be a conversation that happens at the same time. You know, if you're uploading work into this, if you're uploading things that are copyrighted into this, please be careful, check the privacy, check the usage. And if you're not sure, then don't, I think, is probably the default position that we should probably maintain. Okay, so that's the app that we hopefully are going to use. And there it is. Yes, so there is a kind of explicit mention on Notebook LM's homepage that they don't use the personal data to train Notebook LM's data set or the model as well, and that includes the source uploads as well. But obviously, we need to sort of trust that will be maintained. Okay, so we are thinking about the next kind of stage, if you like, of this particular bit of technology. And obviously, this is a mention, a reference towards the fact that we can now call in and talk to the AI hosts. And I've mentioned interactive mode a second ago. We can jump in, we can ask questions, we can interrupt them, we can discourse with them. And we wondered whether that might have scope to help students in a formative assessment capacity. And this is where we really get into the case study that we're actually going to do with our students over the next couple of months. So the module context is a module on which I teach at the University of Liverpool. It's an MA module in English called Victorian Murder and Other Crimes, which I think is the best module title in history. Sorry, other people who have modules. It currently has about 15 to 20 students registered. And what we're planning on doing is asking students to submit a formative assessment into the software. So they'll do a formative essay ahead of a summative essay submission that they do at the end of the module, and they'll be asked to generate a podcast based on the formative work that they've done. And students must then listen to the podcast it generates and reflect on the experience, the effectiveness of the exercise, how well it engages with what they wanted to say in the submission, and how it might help them to kind of reformat the work into a summative submission as well. And students can interrupt and speak to the characters as needed. So what we've done is develop a short sort of evaluation form that we're asking students to complete. So they get a sort of step-by-step guide on how to use the platform. They don't have to do it. We're not mandating it, and we're not marking it. Obviously, this is an exercise if students are interested in getting another source of feedback. What if the podcast is not accurate though? We'll hope when we want students to sort of pick up on that, we want to say to the students, has it? And we encourage students via a kind of number of prompt questions. You know, does the podcast kind of focus on the argument in the way that you intended to in the formative submission? Does it get things right? What does it do differently? And have you interrupted it? What kind of questions did you ask? Did you ask what the assessment could do differently, what it could do better, what it's done really well, who else it could reference if it's aware of that? And then they need to reflect on the experience of essentially getting another source of feedback from a party that they wouldn't otherwise maybe have thought of. And we are going to evaluate whether the students find this useful in the kind of assessment process. The bottom line is that we are discoursing with the work. It's an opportunity for students to kind of talk to the work itself, which is in a way of a sort of method of self-reflection, but using an artificial third party, I suppose, to kind of gain another perspective on the work they themselves have created. Does that make sense? And Peter and Sue, have I described that articulately enough?
I think so. I think so. Just a question based on a comment that Phil Marston's put in the chat. That the students in this experiment that we're doing, they are listening to a podcast which is based on their own writing, and that's really the key thing that we're trying to explore. What does that do to folk if you're listening to a podcast about your own material, and B, if you can then interrogate it in some sense? You know, what does that do? Another comment in the chat there that what if the original material, the draft essay, is produced in AI, so you have AI talking to
That's
AI.
a very good point.
No, we'll absolutely not permit that. Good heavens, no.
I mean, it would be quite interesting to find that out, wouldn't it? To sort of see, you know, if the AI, if an AI critiques the work of another AI, to say this work is terrible. Well, you wrote it. Okay, I didn't realize that. Yeah, I mean, that would be quite interesting to sort of determine. There are another couple of questions that are popping up in the chat that I just kind of want to respond to as well. One of the students would get about based on their writing. Yeah, sorry Phil, that's exactly what we were saying. I saw Lloyd put his own lecture recording into it because I was pretty impressed how he explained the point of Lloyd was lecturing on. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? What I'm hoping, or what I assume is happening, is because the AI model is referring explicitly to the resources that the user has uploaded into the environment, right? So if we're generating this podcast, it's reflecting solely on, I think, the resources that have been kind of put into it, rather than any other kind of other data set that exists. I mean, it might draw on some ideas from elsewhere, but for the most part, it reflects only on that, as it were. So that's why it tends to be quite accurate. And I imagine the more we put into it, the less accurate it would get. So if we're uploading lots of different bits of reading, a huge amount of data into Notebook LM and saying, generate a podcast on all of this, it's going to miss stuff. But if it's one artifact, it's going to refer explicitly to that and say, this is what it does, and this is what it doesn't do. And I did experiment with the interactive element of Notebook LM with my own MA thesis and asked it what I could do better. And just for context, the project explored academic staff perceptions of what authentic assessment means, and sort of tried to determine whether the kind of academic's own cultural background influenced what they perceive to be authentic, and where the kind of student perspective is in that conversation. And you know, it kind of found that a lot of the time the student voice is sort of forgotten. And I said to Notebook LM, what could I do differently? What could I do better? What does this study miss? And it came back to me and it said, you only interviewed staff. You could have interviewed some students as well. Now, I deliberately didn't interview students, mainly because ethical approval was a bit of a nightmare because it was part of an MA and I didn't have any money to pay them. So there was a reason why I didn't, but it was right. I could have interviewed students. That was a much better idea, or it would have been really useful for me to interview students as part of that project. So I kind of got that feedback from Notebook LM, which is generated by the work itself. So it's a hole in the work that the work is telling me, I guess. And that's, we think, could be quite useful. There is a question from Orla in the chat. Do you think this approach can work at scale? That's an interesting question. I think so. I think if the student's doing this in a kind of self-reflexive way, if we gave them the tool to be able to do it and said, why don't you try this? in your assessment process. So you've written a draft, or you've written a a formative version of an assessment that you're going to submit as a summative piece later on, and you want to get some feedback from it. You don't have to always come to me, or you don't have to only come to the tutor or your peers or whatever. There's also this process that you could follow if you think it would be helpful. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And if we give them a framework to reflect on the output, to say, does it focus on the thing you want it to? Does it ask the right questions? Does it make the right argument? Does it articulate the argument in the way that you wanted it to? And ask it to tell you what to do next, or how to change that so that the perspective is different, and see what it says. Then that could be quite a useful string to a student's bow.
Another question in the chat there: can the assessment using AI and what have you still stimulate the deep learning we expect from students? And I think that's a really important question, and it's one that hopefully we will attempt to answer in some sense through this project.
Yes.
I mean, certainly if I'm trying to put myself in the position of a student who all of a sudden has this facility with something they have written, I would be using it, because I don't, the opportunity to hear whether your essay appears to be anywhere near the point could be a really important bit of deep learning.
Absolutely. And I think it's useful to have something to give it in order for it to generate the feedback or the podcast. It's difficult to sort of say, what should I do, if you haven't provided it with anything to start with. So there's always that kind of necessity to at least have had some thoughts and some ideas, and to get something down on paper, and to say, you need to have given it some ideas for it to kind of bounce off and to give you feedback on before it will give you anything useful. It can't give you the answer, but it can help you to understand where your answer is going. Yeah, I think there is a space for this. The
interesting question there from Pedro.
Yeah.
What alternative options are there for students who do not wish to sell their soul to Google? And
I mean, that is a very good question. Yeah. I mean, someone mentioned earlier on, and I have made a note of it, but I've now lost my note, of an alternative podcast generator. And I am conscious that we probably should find another one that does this same kind of thing. So this is very much a pilot study into whether
11 Labs, I think it was.
Was that what it was?
11 Labs one.
11
and
Labs.
There's also another Google one whose name I've just forgotten, and another one with a funny name which I came across last night. So we must put a list together of these, because there are now several podcast generating bits of software.
Yeah.
Obviously prompted by the success of Notebook. But there are now several alternatives, and I'm sure there will be a free alternative somewhere.
Oh, there absolutely will be. I mean, it's the kind of next step. It's another kind of aspect of AI that I reckon will be emulated in other places as well. Does the environmental impact of using such a vast amount of processing power? Oh, the chat's just jumped, so I've lost that question. Sorry.
Just on a side, Sam, there's David's shared a TikTok nurse student outlining how she's using Notebook LM. Will we be sharing the prompt, the link for further case studies?
Yes,
because,
I think so.
If people want to contribute things that they're doing, that could be helpful, couldn't it?
Absolutely. If you've got a case study or something that you've done or you want to share, then do please let one of the project team know.
Question on environmental impact coming in there from EW182. Does using such a vast amount of processing power? That's a very good question, and I think one of the Sue and I are certainly, and Sam, are looking at this whole idea of responsible use of AI as opposed to just ethical use of AI, because the Gen AI companies would love us to be using it 24 hours a day, and keeping it on all the time. The snag is, how do you know what amount of processing power you have used? And we're trying to explore some links with some folk who've been doing some research on that. So we'll watch this space, and we'll hopefully find an answer to that.
Yeah, responsible use of AI, I think, is key at this point. So I think at the moment that the opacity of a lot of AI companies or sort of larger tech companies in terms of what the amount of energy that it uses is a problem. I think the other problem is, dare I say, frivolous use. There's lots of use of artificial intelligence that might not necessarily have a purpose. It's just because it's fun. And I wonder whether part of that kind of AI literacy development conversation is around what constitutes actual use of this technology for a purpose, in the same way as you would use any other piece of technology. for a sort of academic, in an academic or a professional context, versus let's generate some funny images just because I'm bored. And so
and some of the demos by OpenAI on this software, they are extremely frivolous. And again, just assume that you're going to have free access to this stuff all the time and use it for just about anything and everything. There's a quote,
which is the responsible bit there, rather than the ethical, is using it in a correct way, so not for cheating, etc.
In the chat, Pedro's mentioned Illuminate by Google, which is the other podcast software, and there's a wait list on that, as you might expect. But there are others, so we'll find out. And as Stephen Gow points out, there's no such thing as free.
Yes, that's true too. That's a very good point. I mean, we are aware of this conversation. We're looking at the kind of ethical perspectives of this project, and as part of the wider multimodality project as well. So we'll have some answers on that, I think, going forwards as well. There's another couple of comments. Oh, it's Emma. Hi, Emma. Sorry, EW182. Yeah, we weren't sure. The important bit seems to me that the learner is encouraged to have a go at expressing their thoughts and then comparing with views about that, rather than just looking for the right answer. Yeah, exactly. The nature of the formative task and the framing of the ways they're encouraged to think about it seems likely to be key. Yes, you're absolutely right, Kay. That is exactly it. We're asking students to sort of self-reflect on their own work, and the kind of progress that they've made up to this point at the formative stage. Versus obviously the thing they're trying to actually achieve by the time they submit it as a summative thing, and then gain a source of feedback from somewhere else that is a bit little different from where they might otherwise get, but that actually comes directly from the work, that isn't kind of filtered through the individual perspective of a person. It's just a rephrasing, if you like, of the work itself. So in a way, we're sort of talking directly to it. If the same content is submitted twice, how much difference is there in the podcast? Tim, I don't know. That's a very good question. I might make another notebook, resubmit it, and see if the podcast is identical, because I actually don't know yet. I think that's a really good point. Might students not use notebooks solely at the end of the task rather than the start of tasks with draft? They might perceive feedback more valuable when they think they've done it. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point, and I think it would be useful for them to do both. You start off with a really rough draft, see what the direction it kind of suggests is if you ask it what I could do next, and then go back and see what it says once you've refined it a little bit more. I think that's a really good idea. And if you and it might be up to the student to decide when they use when they use the software. Oh, Yanis, sorry. The podcast is not identical if you resubmit. It produces something different. Okay, that's interesting too. Yeah, really good note on that. I am very conscious of time, and I am aware that we could definitely talk about this all day. But the perspective that I'm getting is that this isn't a daft idea, and that it could be very useful in the formative assessment context, which is really encouraging. That was where the demonstration was going to be. Okay, I've got some questions just for sort of discussion right at the end. We can sort of formalize this conversation just a little bit more. What do you think of the software when it's used in this capacity? I guess the overall point is, do you think it has potential? I'm going to sort of leave these questions dangling, if you like, and we can put answers in the chat or on the Padlet, depending on where you prefer to submit them. And should we be making more meaningful efforts to find ways for students to engage with or almost literally talk to their own work in order to understand it better and thereby improve it and their disciplinary knowledge? Do we think there is space for students to be more self-reflexive and self-discursive, using technology like this to be able to interrogate the work they have otherwise produced? I don't know about anyone in the room, but one of the hardest things for me is to go back over my own work and think, what have I not done? What do I need to do differently? It's a very difficult process, I think, for anybody to do, especially when you're doing something that you feel like you know quite a lot about, or that you feel like you know very little about. I think either of those generates that challenge for very different reasons. And for an alternative perspective, but that comes directly from the artifact, to sort of say this is what you could do differently, I think would be particularly useful. So do we think we should be making more meaningful efforts to find ways for students to kind of talk to their work or interrogate their work or be more self-reflective going forward? And if so, what challenges can you see with this approach? We've obviously already talked about data privacy, ethics, and sustainability, but are there any others that you can possibly think of as well? I'm just going to scroll through the chat as well. Yes, it's another channel to get info into your brain, gives a different perspective. Yeah, absolutely. Evaluative judgment is key. Yes, thank you. That's a really good point.
I think the
Is a
key
notebook too
question is
nice?
whether.
Perhaps
Sorry.
sometimes we need an honest appraisal.
That is true.
Yes,
A
true.
notebook is too nice. It does tend to be very very praising, doesn't it? And actually, I wonder whether that goes hand in hand with the potential for it to be just that little bit uncanny. Um, I don't know if anyone's tried it with their own work, but I would encourage you to do so if you haven't. It might feel a little narcissistic. It did the first time I put it in, but I think I got about a minute and a half into the podcast and I had to have a break because it's so strange for someone else to be talking about your work and to be that nice about it. As Tom points out,
But does it come down to the prompts? If you ask it to critique,
you can.
and really point out the
Yes,
flaws,
yes.
if you ask it that, then
It does.
it will respond to that. So
And
it's,
it does it nicely. It would say,
Yeah. You'd
it
hope
says
so.
it says things like, "Oh, I really really like what your work does, but what you could do maybe do differently." And it's very non-committal and it's very sort of nice about it. But
Yes.
it does. It is a little, as Stephen points out, a little sycophantic. You could program a reviewer AI. I think anyone would enjoy that. Oh goodness me. That's oh goodness. I don't think anyone would want to do that. Why would you put yourself through it? Um, Marvelous idea. I agree that frivolous use of AI is distracting and wasteful. Isn't it a bit frivolous to turn a paper into a podcast? Inserting a bunch of let's dive into it, etc. Yeah, I mean there is that. The kind of energy use, I guess, in I guess peppering the podcast with uh, idiosyncrasies in the name of realism, I guess, is a question really that we can't answer here. Is that absolutely necessary? I wonder whether there is a space to sort of think about it in, dare I say, human terms. But we did mention at the start of the session that I guess audio feedback that we kind of produce in the traditional sense is often better received by students because of that human element. The intonation is different. The way that it's phrased is often kinder and friendlier, I guess, and students tend to respond to it better, even if it hasn't quite managed to break its way into the mainstream yet.
But it's down to the individual. Somebody commented earlier, didn't they, from
Yeah.
their perspective, that they get irritated with that. They just
That's
want to cut to the chase. Just
to the
tell
chase.
me.
So
I
I
mean,
suppose
that's one
Sorry.
interesting thought in terms of the way the software is changing and being developed, in this notion of being able to kind of tailor the tone of the podcast to what you need, give it kind of instructions.
Yeah.
So there's the notion of instructions. There's also a recent interview with the people behind Notebook where they were talking about all sorts of potential things that they would like to bring into it, like to the extent of perhaps using your own voice.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So we will keep tabs on this on this software, if only through this project. And,
Would that be even more uncanny if it was yourself
could be,
talking
yeah.
back to you? I don't know.
I mean, there's one optimistic proposition, which is that this software could encourage more engagement with your work because you learn from it through the audio. But let's see what happens.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Couple more points in the chat here. Written feedback is sometimes very wrong. Yes, that's a good point. General AI is designed to be generalist. You can ask ChatGPT to roast your essay. Yeah, I suppose it would be the way you phrase the interaction with the podcast hosts, or or even any kind of AI if you're asking for feedback on something you're putting into it. If you sort of phrase it in a way that says, absolutely go to town on this, and maybe in a slightly more formal way, then it presumably will. And I think we're also kind of in danger of forgetting, or not forgetting, but we haven't mentioned the fact that we can also prompt off the back of that. So, you've done this. Oh, this is what you could do better. Okay, that's a good idea. Can you say a little bit more about that? And it becomes far more conversational and discursive. You can prompt it against the responses that have come out of it from your initial kind of interaction with it as well. And actually, I think you can also ask it, and this isn't necessarily a Notebook LM thing, but I think something struck me this morning. It wasn't so very long ago that every time we used ChatGPT, we were encouraging ourselves to ask it to act in a certain way, act as a person, act as a tutor, act as a someone or other. And we used to kind of say this was like fundamental prompt engineering to say, adopt this persona, adopt this perspective. And I think we have sort of stopped doing that, which I think is quite interesting. I don't really know why. But I think that can be really useful as well. So if you ask it to adopt a particular persona or perspective before you ask the question of it, then it will obviously act in a different way. And we can ask students to experiment with that too. You know, be more critical, act as reviewer too. You know, there is absolutely nothing wrong with doing that if you're feeling particularly brave. Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Interesting
so much.
Suggestion from Amanda in the chat, which is that you load the rubric, the assessment rubric, into Notebook before you ask it to generate the podcast.
Yes, if you had two resources, so the formative assessment and the rubric / marking criterion, and then generated the podcast and asked the hosts to kind of refer to the rubric / marking criteria when you're sort of saying what could this essay do better or differently, then obviously it's going to give far more tailored responses. It's based off that data. And I think this can also not only help students to develop their assessment and feedback literacy, but it can also really help them to develop their literacy on how AI works too. You know, this is the data, this is how it's responding, because this is the data I've fed in, which is something we don't often get the chance to do, I think, as well. Okay, I am very conscious of the time. Really rich discussion in the chat, and thank you ever so much to everyone who has contributed so far. So in terms of whether the software has potential when it's used in this capacity, I think we can maybe conclude that yes, it does, and we will obviously perform this experiment. We have got sort of the approval of the department to do this with the students, and they know it's coming. So we'll let you know how they engage with the activity. The kind of main worry I've got at the minute is that they'll just say, why am I bothering with this? I'm not going to do that. But we'll see how it goes. I kind of think we can maybe conclude that it is a potential avenue for exploration for us to use generative AI technology to help sort of reflect on our work. There's lots of talk about the outputs that come out of AI and the critique that we give to the sort of artifacts that it produces. So, you know, the conversation earlier on in the symposium revolved around should we adopt critique of an AI generated artifact as a standard pedagogic practice, or does it become very boring? I think it was Jeffrey who said that. And I think there is definitely something to be said for that. And I do think there is a sense that we've kind of grasped at that as a method to sort of circumvent the potential threat that AI might pose to us, or the threat that we perceive it might have. Or we can critique the output. Great, there's a solution, there's an answer for us to kind of carry on with the status quo, maybe. I don't know, maybe that's overstating it just a little bit. But there are other things we can do too. We can ask it to critique our work, or we can engage with it in different ways. And there's a few different approaches that we might be able to take. So yes, we think there might be potential for this in future as well. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you ever so much to everyone for your contributions to the discussion. Apologies if you heard my cat in the background scrabbling around in her litter tray. She was extremely noisy, and she chose this moment to do that, as she does every single time. But if you do want to contact us, there are our email addresses. Please do get in touch. Let us know your thoughts, any further questions or comments. I'm sorry I couldn't respond to them all. It was such a busy chat. And again, thank you ever so much again. And do please go back to the main room now, because we are going to do a very quick 10-minute wrap up for the entire symposium. And we hope to speak to you all again very soon.
Thanks everyone for joining.